Hey, welcome back. In the next couple of lectures, we want to set up a widget that will display a countdown timer to the player. We will also set up a win counter that will display how many apples need to be collected to win the game. We will do a lot of the setup in Blueprints since it provides a visual designer. In visual programming, if you are familiar with that, we can drag and drop controls onto a panel and determine their location, for example, a control being a visual element or an element that we can interact with, such as buttons, checkboxes, text boxes, to enter or read text from, and so forth. We can set properties on those controls, such as the text and the tooltip. On a button, for example, you can have OK or cancel or exit or accept, but you can also code what happens when you click or interact with those controls. Similarly, Unreal provides a designer which allows us to position and define controls visually, as opposed to having to do that programmatically. Without the visual tools, we would need to define the controls in C++. This can be useful for complex things such as inventory systems, that is having some C++ backend for that, but for simple things and for defining the locations and basic setup of our controls, a visual edit is more intuitive. This is really where the visual tools in Unreal Engine shines, the visual blueprint systems. Now we will begin by defining the widget blueprint, which is the class that allows us to set up the controls that we want. And then in upcoming lectures, I will also demonstrate how we can set up a C++ widget class with some functions that we can then expose. I will show you different ways of doing the same thing, such as instantiating the widget class, since you may have different requirements for your project. Okay, let's begin by creating our widget blueprint. In the content browser, I will right-click, and under the interface section, we have widget blueprint, so I will select that. We want a user widget, I will select that. I will prefix this blueprint with WBP for widget blueprint, underscore, and then the name. So in this case, I will choose Apple Picker widget. Now you could define different widgets for when the game starts and ends, for example, but I will show you how to set things up in a single blueprint for this project. I will open that up. Notice the blueprint editor has changed a bit. It is not quite the same as we are familiar with the actors. We have this designer section, which, as I mentioned previously, is where we can define our controls visually, and then we also have the more familiar programming graph. You can switch between those using these buttons here, the graph and then the designer. Everything we define in here relates to the same blueprint. The graph is more familiar. We have our events such as tick, and then to the left we have the my blueprint section, for example, which is where our variables and functions will show up, as with the actor blueprints that we have dealt with up until this point. I will go back to the designer. We want to set up a text widget that will display get ready to the player, and eventually we will set up the functionality for this to display a countdown timer from 3 to 1, and finally it will display the text play, so the goal is to define that sort of countdown timer. Now to begin, I will search for panel. We want the canvas panel. The canvas panel allows widgets to be laid out arbitrarily, so when I refer to a widget, I refer to a control or a widget. In Unreal, a control is called a widget. So when we have a canvas panel set up, then we can drag and drop controls where we want those onto the canvas panel, and also define an anchor for those, as we will see here shortly. You should see a hierarchy panel or tab. The first entry in that will reflect the name of your widget blueprint, in this case our Apple Picker widget. This is similar to what you would see in the blueprint editor when you are defining an actor blueprint class. It basically refers to this object. Again, in a similar way to when you are defining an actor blueprint, if you click on that, you will get the class default properties for this widget. Remember that this is where your categories and variables will show up if you have those defined in C++, for example. We will see an example in an upcoming lecture where we set up a widget in C++. Moving on then, let's drag and drop that canvas panel onto this object to form a hierarchy. Now this canvas should show up. It has this blue outline which represents the outside borders of the screen. So we want to place our controls within that outline. Navigation is the same as in the graph. Scroll wheel to zoom, right mouse button to pan around, and we will use left mouse button to select, edit or place controls. Okay, now that we have that canvas panel set up, we want to set up a text control, so we can navigate to the comment section and then we can left click and drag in a text control. You can also drop that on the canvas in the hierarchy panel, but I will actually just click and drag and drop that onto the canvas like this. Notice in the hierarchy panel that this is now a child of that canvas panel. We can rename the control when it is selected. In the top section of the details panel, we can rename that. This will be the countdown timer text. If we switch over to the graph, our text control does not show up as a variable. We want that to show up so that we can set properties on that. We want to get or set a reference to that as you can do with a variable. So if we go back to the designer with that text control selected, you may have noticed that we have this isVariable toggle. I will check that isVariable toggle and then go back to the graph. Now that control shows up as a variable, we can now drag that into the graph, and when we let go as expected, we can set or get that. Back in the designer, we can also define the anchors for the control. If the screen size changes, the distance from the anchor to our control will remain constant. We need to keep in mind that some players will resize their screens and maybe play in different resolutions on different devices. For example, we can select the center option here, and with the text control selected, you will notice this flower or medallion shows up. This is our anchor. The anchor is now centered on our canvas. You can decide on precisely where you want to place this control, but I'll move mine up a bit and away from the center of the screen. I will set the position Y to -125. To keep the text widget centered, you may want to enter 0 for the position X. However, when we do this, we do not get the results that we may expect. It is not centered. Notice where the grid lines are. This is because of the alignment settings. The outline of the control is that green box, right? Now, with the alignment, we can imagine that our control has a pivot point, kind of like how our actors have a pivot point in the level, but this is in 2D. We adjust that pivot point using the alignment property. Now, alignment is set from 0 to 1. The upper left is 0, 0, and then the bottom right corner of the control is 1, 1. So if you think about it for a second, how can we center that pivot point? Okay, when will that be at the center of the control? Well, the center of the control will be at 0.5 and 0.5, right? So let's set that. Press enter and notice that the pivot of our control has updated. With the position X set to 0, the control is now centered on the canvas. Again, you can use the grid as a guideline. I will also check size to content to make sure that our text actually fits within the control. And of course, we can change the font, and for this, I will only change the font size and set that to 40. Around 40 should be fine. You can increase that if you want. Then in the content category, we have the text variable, which we can change to get ready, for example. Press enter and notice that will update in the canvas. Then for justification, we want to center align that. This is under the appearance category. Click to center align that. Remember, we will update that text programmatically. And since this will display our countdown text in numbers such as 3 to 1, for example, such as 1 as we can see here, we want those numbers to be centered, otherwise it will look strange. For now, I will set that back to get ready. In this blueprint editor, we also have the play controls up here, and so we can choose to play right in here. I will choose to play in a new editor window, for example. But notice the widget does not display. Why do you think this is? I will go to the Apple Picker Game Mode Blueprint definition. Remember that many of the game classes are handled by the game mode. You can see those under the classes category. Classes like the default pawn class, the player controller, and so forth. As we've seen in previous lectures, we can specify our custom classes here, such as the default pawn class. We specified our basket blueprint. Currently, nothing is managing our widget class. That is, it is not created or instantiated by any other class. It is not an actor that we have dragged and dropped into the world, into the level. So we need to manage that in some other way. It makes sense that we would want to instantiate our widget blueprint on begin play. We have a node called create widget under the user interface section. Let's select that and hook that execution wire to the begin play event. Next, we have to specify the class that we want to instantiate. Let's click on that drop down here and select our Apple Picker widget, the blueprint. If we compile and save and play now, the widget will not appear yet. The reason for this is that while the instance exists at this point, we have not added it to the viewport. We have a node called add to viewport under the interface section. I will select that, and now we have to specify the target. So what widget do we want to add to the viewport? Well, the create widget node returns a reference to the instantiated widget, so we can use that return value for the target, hook that up like this. You can actually also drag off from that reference the blue output and then type add to viewport to get that node. Compile and save, and let's try that one more time. Play the level and our get ready text now shows up. A quick recap, our game manager manages many important classes as we have seen. Those are specified in the class default section under the classes category. Now, as I've demonstrated before, when we hit play, some of those classes are spawned into our level, and we can actually filter for those in the world outliner, for example, and we will see that those are spawned into the level, such as the player controller, the pawn that we have defined, and so forth. Those don't just spawn in or exist by themselves. Our game manager defines which classes to instantiate when we hit play. Now, as I've discussed, many of those are actually actor classes, but a user widget derives from widget, which is a U object. So it is not an actor, and we need to construct to instantiate that somehow, otherwise it will simply not exist, right? And so this is how we do that. On begin play, we create the specified widget, and then we call this function to add that to the viewport. Alright, back in our widget definition, I'll actually play one more time. This is what we get currently. But we can add a shadow to the text, which will help it stand out just a bit. To begin, I will copy and paste that. You could also just duplicate. I won't modify or use this new one, it's just here for a reference. Maybe move that to the side so that we don't get confused. With the primary text widget selected, let's give that a shadow. In the appearance category, we have the shadow color. Currently the alpha is set to 0, which is why we don't see a shadow. We can click on that to open the color picker. You can observe the effect of your changes in this section here, where it says old at the top and new at the bottom. So the effect of your changes will show up in the new section in the bottom section. Alright, let's change the alpha closer to 1. I'll just click and drag to the right. Observe that we get some of that black color in the new section now compared to the old or previous setting. I'll actually set that to 1 and click OK. Play around with some of the other properties such as shadow offset if you want. Compile and save. And if we playtest now, notice the difference. I think having the shadow makes a big difference, so I'll leave it like this. I will delete the reference text widget. Okay, at this point we have the basic widget set up, we have the location defined, the font size, and so forth. So next we need to implement the countdown logic, which will set the text property on the widget in such a way that it represents a countdown timer. This video is getting a bit long, so we will set up the logic for that in the next video.